Hey, how are you? My name is Jeremy. I'm going to be reading from Essentials of Strength Training and Conditioning. Be on page 134. External influences on the cardiorespiratory response. Page 134. The variety of external factors can influence both the acute response and the chronic adaptation of the cardiovascular and respiratory systems to exercise. The effects of altitude, hyperoxic breathing, smoking, and blood doping are described here. Altitude. At elevation greater than 3,900 feet, 1,200 meters, acute physiological adjustments begin to occur to compensate for the reduced partial pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere. Two adjustments that occur early in the acclimatization process are particularly important. First, there is an increase in pulmonary ventilation, hyperventilation, at rest and during exercise. The increase in ventilation is primarily the result of increased breathing frequency. With longer stays at high elevation, however, increased tidal volume also contributes to augmented ventilation. Stabilization of ventilation is dependent upon level of altitude. Second, in the early stages of altitude exposure, there is an increase in cardiac output at rest and during submaximal exercise, due primarily to increases in heart rate. Submaximal heart rate at cardiac output can increase 30 to 50% above sea level values, and stroke volume is constant or slightly reduced. Increased submaximal cardiac output reflects the need for increased blood flow at a time when arterial blood oxygen content is reduced. Within 10 to 14 days at a given altitude, heart rate and cardiac output begin to return to normal values because of the longer-term acclimatization response of increased red blood cell production. Thus, with acute exposure to altitude, hyperventilation and increased submaximal cardiac output are rapid and relatively effective responses to offset the challenges of the reduced partial pressure of oxygen. However, despite these adjustments, arterial oxygen saturation decreases and results in decreases in maximal oxygen uptake and aerobic performance. Changes revert in about 1 month after return to sea level. Chronic physiological and metabolic adjustments that occur during a prolonged altitude exposure include increased formation of hemoglobin, generally 5 to 15% increase, although higher values have been reported, and red blood cells, 30 to 50% increase. Increased diffusing capacity of oxygen through the pulmonary membranes, the maintenance of the acid-base balance of body fluids to renal excretion of HCO3 and through hyperventilation, and increased capillarization. That's a good one. All these adaptations generally improve tolerance of the relative hypoxia at medium and high altitudes and may result in nearly sea level exercise capacities with adequate acclimatization. A minimum of 3 to 6 weeks is needed to adapt in moderate altitude. However, reduced performance is generally expected with altitude exposure, regardless of the period of acclimatization. Strength and conditioning professionals are encouraged to remind athletes of both expected acute responses and chronic adaptations to altitude so that athletes can maintain appropriate training regimens and a positive mental approach to impact of altitude. Hyperoxic breathing. Breathing oxygen-enriched gas mixtures. Hyperoxic breathing during rest periods or following exercise may positively affect some aspects of exercise performance. Although the mechanisms for these results are not well understood and the procedure remains controversial, it is suggested that hyperoxic breathing increases the amount of oxygen carried by the blood and therefore increases the supply of oxygen to working muscles. The breathing of ambient air at sea level by healthy people results in arterial hemoglobin oxygen saturation of 95 to 98%. Thus, hyperoxic breathing during rest periods of post-exercise has little potential for increasing this value. However, psychological, the placebo effect, or other physiological advantages may account for the infrequent reports of positive effects. Cool. I'll leave it there. Page 134 to 135. External influences of the cardiorespiratory response. It's your altitude and your hyperoxic breathing. All right? Cool. See ya.